Hi there. This is actually a great topic for me to expand a little bit here on in this post, but I almost feel like it should be a separate post. I've worked a lot with men who have a pornography addiction, more so than women. One of the let me share a little bit about my experiences with working with people who have a pornography addiction. A lot of times it stems from men early on, and there's a couple of different reasons, or I'll say some characteristics or some experiences that men have gone through when they have a pornography addiction. Typically, not always. It typically stems in men who were neglected for long periods of time, specifically by their parents. So they often spent a lot of time at home alone. They maybe were latchkey kids or something like that. And so they were pretty much in charge of like their own autonomy and their own responsibilities from a very early age in boyhood. They may have also been left alone with strangers or other people that weren't necessarily appropriate for them to be left with, and so they typically have sexual experiences very early on, a lot of times with someone who is much older, like decades older than them. And it's not something that they talk about for many years to come. And unfortunately, in a lot of cases, it is considered sexual assault, but men don't encode it in their brain, or they don't, that narrative doesn't translate for many men that they were sexually assaulted or even raped by someone who was much older than them. So there's a lot of skewed, there's there's just there's just a lot of they just have a lot of misinformation in the way that they interpret sex, for lack of a better word at this time. Brain is a little bit fried at the moment. But the other thing about pornography that with men, especially particularly men who were neglected or men who have these adverse sexual experiences at such an early age, pornography becomes popular, or addiction, because of a few different variables here. One, pornography is something that is easily accessible. And two, it's a form of escapism. So it's very fantasy based. When people engage in watching pornography over and over and over, and it becomes, it's a fantasy. And particularly with men who are abandoned or neglected for a long period of time, they engage in a lot of fantasy-based thinking anyway, so they're very imaginative. They can be very creative. Other things that may come into play with men who have fantasy-based addiction or habits is like video gaming. So you may have sort of trade-offs between consuming a lot of television, or playing a lot of video games, and pornography, and those things may be interchangeable because they're all very fantasy based. They're also something that somebody can lose themselves in for such long periods of time. With fantasy based thinking around pornography, a lot of men tend to focus on that because it's something that they can control. And they often switch themselves out with the actors in pornography. And so it also can cause them to develop like this godlike feeling about themselves, like I'm God because I'm in a movie and I can control these characters. And they attempt to recreate that in their sex life, where they're attempting to mimic what they saw on this pornography. So that's why a lot of men who are addicted to pornography aren't actually good sexually with their partners, because they're too busy trying to mimic or role play what they saw on that movie, versus being tuned into what their partner wants, if that makes sense, and having that conversation about like, what works for us, as opposed to let me just copy and paste what I saw in pornography because that girl up there loved it so much. So surely this woman that I'm with here is loving it. And so it doesn't necessarily compute or register that these are paid actors. Sex doesn't really look like this in everyday real life, where you could just go on and on and on, you know, and oh, everybody loves it. And it's like the best thing ever, no matter how graphic and violent or just inappropriate it is. But a lot of men interpret that fantasy and attempt to apply it to real life. And I won't say it's just men, because it's women too. But in my experience, I've worked a lot more with men with pornography addiction. Pornography is also a form of escapism. A lot of men who have this addiction have a hard time connecting with real people, just even connecting in conversations. This also becomes a problem when they start to date. They want to revert back to porn because porn is, again, it's very controllable. I don't have to have any feelings. We could just do what we do, and it helps to relieve my anxiety or my overthinking about things. Whereas dating, I'm nervous. You know, this is a real person. Things don't actually work out like the way that I fantasize them in my mind, and this person talks, breathes, and has expectations, and I don't know what to do with that, and you know. So there's kind of all these freak out moments that kind of come into play. But and also they may find themselves wanting to jump into bed very quickly with someone to, again, recreate pornography, because porn often leads to sex addictions as well. Not always, but a lot of times it leads into that. And so that addictive, that compulsion to, like, let's just have sex very quickly and get over it. And that way I could be somewhat sane again. And then a lot of times once I've had it with you, I don't want to deal with you anymore, because you are a person that's real with feelings and wants and needs and desires. And I don't want to deal with that. I just want to deal with stuff where I'm in control at all times, and I want to be the master of my own fantasy, and real life becomes very difficult. Men also have trouble with emotionally regulating around sex in general, if they've had sexual assault and or trauma. What I found with most male victims is the ones that have sexual assault and trauma, especially from early on, they never ever talk about it. They never tell anybody. And so this porn also becomes safer, if you will, for them to sort of have their needs met without actually engaging with someone. It's still it could still be a form of dissociation involved in intimacy practices. And so that's just a tidbit there, and I hope that helps.